Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. I'm concerned, going to the Syrian refugee crisis, how can we get the Gulf countries to give a bit more and actually take some of the Syrian refugees? And I think this has been a failure, partly, I'm sorry to say, Stephen, of the United Nations. I don't think they could have done a lot more. I mean, what pressure can be done? And
okay, that's a good question, and it was brief. Lady there, we'll take a few at the same time. Lady there.
Karen Christensen, currently unaligned.
Well, non-aligned.
Not either. Context is king, yes, obviously, we've known this for decades. The thing that strikes me that hasn't come up at all is the only way you're going to change your behaviour in context is if you know what it is. Right now, if you try and actually figure out who's spending what, where, live, real time, we have no idea. So changing the aid system and all the other actors out there who are increasingly more important, behaviour in context requires transparency first and foremost. And I'm a bit worried that IATI, the aid transparency agenda, hasn't actually come up at all here, when it seems to me the only solution, highly limited as it is, that actually helps make context king.
Okay.
One very small observation.
I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to go to the gentleman. One more, which is to pass the microphone along.
Thank you. The feature's not here. Feature's already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Sorry, who are you?
Ben Ramalingam. I work for the Institute of Development Studies. Yes. I think the future of the humanitarian sector is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think we can already see the birth pangs of the kind of system this report is calling for in different places. Yes. We see national disaster management agencies taking control, kicking out the cluster system. We see national NGOs doing remarkable work, serving their populations. We see communities themselves responding in really active and proactive ways. My challenge is the humanitarian bubble does not help these people do this. When this has happened, it's been almost always because of national systems that have got fed up with the humanitarian system, done work at the margins of that system, and actually, interestingly, it's development actors that have had the foresight to fund those. So the National Disaster Management Agency in Mozambique, funded by the German Development Agency.
Okay, I'm going to put a bit of
so my question,
fed up with the humanitarian. What's the question?
So my question is really to Penny and Mark. What can we do, not just to link relief to development, but actually to get development actors working more proactively in this space?
Okay. Penny, can you take that question now? Yeah.
So on that last question, I want to tell a very brief story. Pakistan is 2010, terrible floods in Sindh and Punjab, and we had been operating as Oxfam in Pakistan with a partnership approach. So we had a partnership unit in our long-term development programme team. And we took the radical decision that we wanted them to advise and support our humanitarian folk. Can you imagine? It might remember, it was fisticuffs. But we said, no, we are not going to respond ourselves. We're going to enable our partner organisations to respond. Within 2 weeks, it was a disaster, and it didn't work, and we failed miserably. I went out there to explain to partners and see if they would remain our partners, having made that mistake. Cut a long story short, 2011, we went, repeated floods, we went back to them and said, right, instead of you lending your staff to us this time, we're going to lend our staff to you, and we're more confident. And it worked. And the next time round, 2013, sadly floods again, they were capable and they were able. But it took us being brave, and it took us failing and learning from that failure, which was a very painful thing, Ben, because people suffered as a result of our failure. So I think it's a real challenge for all of us. But even in a multi-mandate organisation, I struggle to get long-term development people and humanitarian people working together. And we have to be honest about that, put it on the table, say, what's the strategy then? What's the continuum? If you put that Nepali woman at the centre of your thinking, and she is going to be more resilient by having diverse livelihoods, so you can do that in peacetime, but you have to be ready, and your staff have to be skilled up to note, now in a flood, then we have to go into cash programming and then market recovery, and then you have to describe the strategy entirely differently. Okay. So you have to shift the whole way you operate as an organisation, I think.
Okay, I'm going to put, Stephen, the first couple of questions I wanted to put to you, which is Gulf countries. I actually have two questions on that, which is, one is, should they give more and take more refugees? That was the question. But also, how is that changing the system when you have the Gulf countries, China and so on? Is that... We're talking about these different sources of funding. is it changing the system, and is it changing the system for the better or the worse?
Well, let's be clear. Let's start from the people again rather than the money, because the money, I think everybody knows, it's even if you were to make a broad assessment, we need about $25 billion to meet immediate needs, of which we raise something like 10 at the moment in the so-called system, and about 5 or 6 is coming from other sources, whether it's from China or from remittances or whatever, in terms of support. The issue on the people issue is that could, for instance, the Gulf countries take more of the people fleeing Syria compared to where we are today? And could the UN do more about that? Well, the first thing is that people will go, and it's very important we hold to the voluntary principle. People will go where ultimately they want to go, and that is part of what we, as those operating under international law, want to see, is people have the chance to go where they wish to go. And there's putting to one side, if I may, the whole question about refugee status, but we can see that Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon and Egypt have taken enormous numbers of people fleeing Syria, but not the Gulf countries. And when you ask the people who have fled from Syria to the neighbouring countries, let alone those who might want to come further afield, they say, no, we didn't want to go into the Gulf countries. Now it's not our job, or indeed I would suggest anybody's job, to say that's where they should have gone. On the other hand, the Gulf regarded as their job, until the recent collapse in the oil price, as being to provide significant funds. But then we had to go through a process, and I'm sure people are well aware of this, that if you want to use that funding, then it does need to be in accord with humanitarian principles, so that we actually only use the test of need and vulnerability, and that we do have universality, and that it's not possible to give money and to say you can only give it to one side of a fight that's going on, because if you do that, you're absolutely in breach of the principles. And it's all very well, you can do it one time, but once you've breached that dam, then of course you end up with partial aid being offered to in order to get the necessary funding. So
can I stop you there,
yes,
Stephen? Because I actually want to put that.
More.
I want to put that point to Sarah, because that is a very important humanitarian principle that Stephen has outlined. And yet, in this report, you're talking about overturning humanitarian principles, and it seems to me that what he's just said isn't that rather critical?
No, we're definitely not talking about overturning humanitarian principles. We're talking about being a lot more honest about how we use humanitarian principles, and this is a fundamental problem that the sector has. What we're saying is that we should not use humanitarian principles to, in a way, put barriers to other respondents, when actually the sector itself, many organizations do not live up to the principles that they, aim to espouse or pronounce to espouse. And if you, look in, specifically, I mean, you see the, very many multi-mandated organizations, Oxfam is one, do not sign up to the principle of neutrality because they engage on issues that are related, to political, campaigning, democracy, human rights, you name it. There is variety in the sector. Independence, a lot of them are not obviously financially independent or operational independent, so that independence can be questioned. And even if we look at impartiality, if we look at responding according to need, even that, I mean, looking at the constraints that we have in terms of where we operate and how, and the kind of choices we make about where we operate, even the principle of impartiality, we could question that is not, always upheld by those who are part, if you want, of the international response system. So what we're saying is, let's be honest about who is responding to in according to what principles and when. They are absolutely essential, and the report is very clear on that. And it calls actually for a more classical form of humanitarianism that sort of lives up to the principle to be protected in the situation where this is essential, but to make sure that the humanitarian exceptionalism, as we call it in the report, that the principles almost help if you want design, does not create a barrier to use, to engage with the development actors, to engage with, the business sector, to engage with a large number of other respondents, and capacities.
Who haven't signed up to
exactly.
those principles. Do you want to take them out? But can you also take in what the lady was asking about transparency?
That's what I wanted to respond to.
Yes.
Because you're, I think, 100% right. I think there needs to be a lot more light shone on what's happening where. And Lindsay won't like it because it's KPMG who are doing the study I mentioned earlier. But the point of that study is to do exactly what you've described. And I think transparency is one of the most powerful forces in global public policy, and we're not using it nearly enough in this sector. Just an observation, if I may, on where Syrians are going. I mean, one thing I've been told in a series of recent visits to Riyadh is that there are, in fact, a lot of Syrians in Saudi Arabia, a lot more than there were a few years ago, and they're
when they came.
Yeah.
but the numbers increased a lot.
But they're not
since,
refugees. They're not counted as refugees.
well,
are they?
this is my point really. The numbers increased a lot since 2011. They're accessing health and education services. There's some sort of how much do we know and classification issues that are risk sort of muddying and obfuscating a little bit what really is going on. I think more information about all this would be a good thing.
Yeah, which is always difficult with the Saudi government. Believe me, I know, I'm a journalist. We've got Eve, I want to come to you also on transparency, but we've got a question here which has come up on the iPad from Linda Potiat. Many donors saying they want to programme more through local and national NGOs, but it's difficult for many of those NGOs to meet the understandably rigorous financial accountability and other requirements. So are the donors putting systems in place to facilitate local and national NGOs to receive the funding directly, or is this just all lip service? I mean, maybe that isn't a question for you because ICRC works. Maybe I can put that back to you, Mark, before.
Well, I think there is a role for intermediaries here, actually. I think a lot of what we're doing in that space is done through, for example, the international NGOs. But if you look at the breakdown of our budget and how it's changed over the last several years, and you look at our forward programming, you can see more investment going where the goal is to build up local capacity. One of the key things is investments not just on programs delivered to you, but investments in capacity, which is where things like this Humanitarian Academy, which is about building skills and capability, is, I think, still an underinvested in area.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions. No, you can't, because I'm going to get more questions in, and then you're going to have a point to say at the end. Right, I'm going to take a question from a gentleman at the back over there.
Yes, thank you. Howard Mollett from Care International. Many of the problems we heard about in the videos spoke to protection and political failures, and yet most of the solutions we've heard have been about assistance and funding and the kind of technocratic aspects of the system or the ecosystem. So I wanted to ask the panel, particularly in light of what played out with the Red Crescent movement conference at the end of last year, with the attempt to get this more consensual state reporting mechanism on IHL not coming through, is the summit an opportunity to get some other kind of progress on the protection front or something else?
Yeah. Okay. Let's take another one from over on that side. Yes, lady at the front, and then I'm going to do a couple from here, and then we're going to have to wrap. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's Sandrine from MSF. I just want to make a point more generally about where we see the system going, and
I want you to ask a question, not make a point.
Oh.
So ask a question.
Okay, I don't.
Okay, don't then. You don't have a question? You don't get the microphone. Over here, lady in the front here. Do you have a question?
I do have a question.
Good.
Yes. Deepti Sastry, Start Network. Actually, this is a question that I'm picking up from the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, which seems remarkably like a little bit of consolidation of power and resources, a lot of what's coming through the Grand Bargain. So I'd like to see how that marries up against the localization question that seems to be coming up, both in the report and a lot of what we're discussing over here as well.
So you think it's going the opposite direction?
It seems like that, yes.
Okay, fine. I'm going to take one more. This lady here. And then...
Hi, Lauren Edmonds from Rescue Global. What needs to, in regards to specifically natural disasters, what needs to happen to prioritise the sovereignty of those in disaster-affected areas as a mean of building their resilience in those countries?
Sovereignty of the people or the state?
Sovereignty of the people
Right.
and the state.
Okay, that sounds like a rather theoretical question. Let's take another one. Anybody other question? Okay, we're going to do the front row because I'm biased in favour of the front row.
Mirelle Flores, World You Should Live. And I guess my question goes towards something that is happening in our organization with Ukraine. And how do you work in the non-government control areas? And you talked a little bit about, kind of like breaking those barriers to allow funding and get people to respond. But a lot of the donors at the moment are not necessarily keen in investing, for example, in non-government control areas, which is a challenge for us to be able to respond. And everything is in the government control area. So what do you do? Do you work with the terrorists? Do you work with Russia? Do you send your money through Russian bank accounts? So this is a lot of questions that are happening in the
I
organization.
think that goes to the heart of a lot of the issues which I think everybody on this panel has mentioned, which I think also comes back to what the first question, which is, political problems. There are no humanitarian solutions to political problems, and everything is in these complex political contexts. So because we are running out of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to respond to any of those questions they want, but also to combine that with their summing up remarks. And so I'm going to go with Penny first.
Sure. So I'll take your problem around the problem you identified around sovereignty of people, particularly in contexts where people are affected by natural disasters. So I think there is an approach we need to, and by governments. If you look at the El Nino response, there are very few responses where you can take a number of countries and compare, but you can with the El Nino. And there are good guys and bad guys. The good guys, Kenya, Indonesia, all planned well. They put money aside. They have a national growth plan, but they have a contingency plan which they scale up and scale down. Malawi, Zimbabwe, the Central American states simply don't do that. And something needs to happen to say, oi, this is your responsibility. I think we also have talked a lot on the panel around the context is everything, and made general comments as if they applied to everywhere. There's something we need to have in between here. There's some categorization to say, what type of state is this, Stephen? Is this a willing and capable state? In which case, here's the off-the-shelf default that we will have, where we have local capacity. Our default is, say, what is the local capacity doing and how do we support it? This is an unwilling and incapable state. We go immediately into old humanitarian system type language. We need a more sophisticated way of quickly making an assessment. I don't think it's just about collective approaches. And my parting comment would be, great report. If we're serious about making progress, we need to ask why. What are the blockages to these challenges? And how do we honestly have a conversation together around how we work across our different agencies to remove those blockages, to enable us to realize the goal of a diverse ecosystem in which we can enable it to work speedily and quickly, and we can get more real, because Ben's right, the future is here already.
Okay, Eve, I wonder if you could take on the first question about
so you don't
protection.
give me a choice, okay.
I give you every choice,
No,
but
no,
I
good.
would kindly request you to do as I ask.
Good. Now let's start with protection, because I think it's
it's a
the
really
critical one,
important question.
and I totally agree with the colleagues of Care International.
Yeah.
I think if there is one gap right now, if I look really our collective, which goes beyond formal sectors, is clearly about protection. And I think we are confronted with a lot of issues around protection. And I think if there is, how can we do that? I think first, if I'm looking at the World Humanitarian Summit, I don't think the World Humanitarian Summit will resolve everything. But let's make sure that if we agree that the World Humanitarian Summit put protracted conflict at the core, it need to put also protection at the core, right? Mm-hmm. And then if we agree, then we have to connect with what you said, is we have to agree that there is no other way than to have a complementary approaches. Mm-hmm. Clearly, we will have different actors doing that. And I would call for then a different type of collaboration and coordination. So when we talk about the YASC, forget about the YASC how it is constructed, Stephen. Let's have a YASC, for example, who focus the next 3 years on protection. Let's have a purpose. So what we bring is a collaboration, and then when we coordinate, it's not about agencies, but we coordinate about issues where we think the next 2 or 3 years, this is where we want to push. Because of course you will have to continue to have, first of all, a direct approach, engage directly the people, I have no doubt. And here access is critical, again, yes. And repeated access, not just one. And we have to agree that if conflict is at the core of what we do, we will have to work also in area controlled by non-state armed groups. Very clearly. And we need to learn about that. And then no other options than to allow, again, a direct access, engagement, talking to people, talking to non-state armed group. And here, I just would like to make a call. This is where principal approach is so important. This is where transparency is approached. But transparency is not just about donors or about here. People, the population, they know what we're doing. When you talk in Afghanistan, they know exactly what we were able to do. Are we impartial or not? So it's a time where you have to demonstrate. Let's be clear. They will not judge us about what we say or not, what we're able to do. Are we able to, in fact, commit ourselves? And people understand that we don't have access immediately. But what they want is that we try harder, that we're committed, we are ready, and we are radically principled in order to be able to do. Protection will be like that. But protection is also, if I look at my organization, being able to access directly people, do the work over time, but also collaborate with also different organizations. Human Rights Watch does a fantastic work. They're not sitting at the desk. We should think differently how we collaborate if we want to be able to. So the key word is, and this is something I did like in the report, is about competition. I think competition is something positive if it's not, as you mentioned, eating each other. A collaborative competition is something positive. So let's make sure, look at some of the things happening in other sectors, but let's make sure that collaboration happens around key issues. And my call would be, yes, we have to move on when it comes to protection. We have to be very careful. Healthcare in danger. Look at what happened in the hospital. Look at what's happened around the world. And the state will not be able to respond over the next 5 years. So it will be about us to make sure that we are able to collaborate and make the difference. I'm really convinced about it.
Okay, very good. Sarah, can I come on to you for concluding thoughts? And I don't know if any of these particular questions you want to take on.
I can, try and address a little bit both the sovereignty and the localization, although I think on Granberg
Yes.
would be better place to
Yes.
to comment. But and actually also say to Penny that we do talk a lot about the blockages and the disincentives in the report. And that's precisely what the report tries to bring out, the way in which the system has evolved and has been constructed and type of pressures that it has at the top, whether it is by the boards of the organizations that are part of the system, the way in which institutional growth is seen as an important incentive, the way in which, staff growth is seen as an incentive, the way in which, the growth in resources is seen as an incentive, is part of the problem. So it's not just, the kind of, funding and the kind of, donors that we have. It's also the way in which many organizations have evolved and the way in which, we, or rather the international sort of system, sort of interacts with one another. And a lot of it is elaborated and is also part of the work that we're doing now as part of this project on, constructive deconstruction is called, on the architecture of the system that we're trying to, dig deeper in. But just to conclude, I think for me, a lot of the discussion often end up focusing on the resources and the money, and how the money should, sort of go differently or be managed differently. We try to really stress in the report that actually the problem is with, a culture shift, is a mindset shift. Is trying and look at this collaboration in a different way. Try and look at these, partnerships with a variety of respondents in a different way. Taking, the international established response system a bit out of the center of the question and think about what can we do to be really complementary. I have to say I've been in this sector for 23 years. I am so tired of hearing of building capacity. I've heard that when I started, young 22-year-old in Sudan. Well, if you haven't built capacity in 23 years, maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe we're looking at the wrong capacity. Often capacity translates into helping local organizations speak better English and write reports that fit with certain requirements, if not, or a technical English that is our jargon in the sector. That's not capacity. What is our capacity? To work in contexts and in cultures that we do not understand well. That's where that complementarity is essential. But the partnerships are a misnomer. They're so asymmetrical. We continue to set the directions as an international system and drive them, and we don't really, allow the strategic engagement to come from our partners on the ground. Until we change our mindset and come together, we are not going to make a change.
Okay, Sarah, Mark, can you come in on that? That was quite an interesting point, wasn't it, about capacity building, I think?
So I wanted also to pick up the point made by the woman from the START network on the grand bargain and localisation. I think we should take that away, actually. Maybe, I will. Maybe Stephen wants to as well. Whether there's enough localism in the grand bargain is a good question. The broader observation I wanted to make, which sort of picks this up, is, if we'd been having this discussion, sit in this room 30 or 40 years ago, the places we'd have been talking about would have been Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Angola, Mozambique, the civil war in Ethiopia, the Balkans, and my point is we shouldn't lose confidence and hope about the ability to move forward, because a lot of places have come a long way, including building national capacity and solving more of their own problems. And one of the other things, if you do this decade after decade, you have to hold on to is things can get better.
Things can get better. Stephen, can I come to you for a last thought? And I want to challenge you with what Sarah said about what's needed is a mindset shift and a culture shift. It's not, and we understand that, of course, you're concerned about the resources. It's your job to be concerned about the resources. We totally understand that. But in a sense, that doesn't answer the main critical issues in this report, which is about doing things in a different way, not for the sake of it, but because the world has changed. And with remittances, local organisations, it's already happening, and the humanitarian system is being left behind. Is there anything that you can add to that or take from that?
Well, yes, and just pick up on a few points, and I certainly will address that, but I think it's been very important that in this last round, picked up by Eve, that we do understand that given the way the world has changed, that protection is part of the centrality of what we have to deliver. And I think that really does matter, because there's no question that there is no humanitarian solution to any political failure. We are picking up the gaps. The best thing we can do is to make sure it isn't only humanitarian that we're dealing with, that we are integrating this with political approaches, trying to get safe, unimpeded access, making sure we're principled, but at the same time working on how do we genuinely deliver a strategy that moves from pure survival to the ability to, through hope, give people the chance to thrive, and making people the agents of their own future. And often that is helped and prompted by local NGOs and local agencies, and indeed, where they're functional and responsible, local governments, because so much of this discussion tends to have conflict in mind, and that's understandable given the context of the world. But in natural disasters, as we've heard, it's local national disaster management and relief agencies, which are often now, as Mark has just observed, highly capacitated compared to where they were. We've just seen that in Fiji, where we are very strongly partnering. That's the good word, the right word to use when it comes to natural disaster. It's much more difficult in conflict to talk about partnering. There, I find that I'm picking up on, in terms of the coordination responsibilities I have today, that I find I can't use the word coordination. It's more about how do I replace ineffective competition within the system with effective collaboration, to pick up on Sarah's point. And this effective collaboration is very, very tough because of those vested interests that Mark referred to at the very early outset. And I think that Eve's point about re-looking at the composition of the IASC, I've got to be careful not to open it up to the point where it becomes just a huge talk shop, rather than having the ability to bring together issues that then deliver some results which are going to be effective on the ground. But I do think this idea of moving it into a more thematic approach rather than necessarily simply according to the issues that arise, that may be one of the ways of the future. And I certainly want to address this question, which was a very good question, about how local is the content of what could come out of our discussions on the so-called Grand Bargain. And the Grand Bargain, taken in its widest meaning under the World Humanitarian Summit, it's work in progress. We're all currently very engaged in securing this, prompted, of course, by the financing side. But let's be absolutely clear. To get a good Grand Bargain coming out of the World Humanitarian Summit, this will be a new business model. This will be a new way of working. De-siloization, for a start, from our internal perspective, but actually connecting it with local people so that we're accountable in putting people at the centre. And that will require, in the Grand Bargain, to make sure those accountability mechanisms, through transparency, through collective needs assessment, through much more local empowerment, will be much more locally responsible. And I think that the point that also arose was the question of Ukraine, which I wouldn't want to get overlooked in the questions that were just raised, because there you're facing the absolutely huge challenge that the de facto authorities do not want any INGOs or NGOs operating whatever in their territory. The UN has got to struggle enough trying to get anywhere. There are 2 million people in the Donbass region, 1 million on the contact line, and another 1 million in the eastern central region of Ukraine. and they all have different issues and they all have different problems, and the only people, other than a bit of the UN getting through at the moment, are the Russians supplying from Russia into the Donbass region. And so there's a very good example of how we have to be context specific and in negotiating with the de facto authorities, where in the end we have to be very clear. There is an absolute need for us to get to the people, whereas at the moment the whole of the discussion has been about how is the UN going to recognise that we're an independent republic, and they're not interested about us reaching the people. It's all been about that. So you have to understand that we are never divorced, sadly, from the politics and the political context. I mean, after all, the UN is ultimately an expression of the member states, but I have, under the principles, the ability to talk to everybody, something which some of my member states, not least the one that Mark represents, aren't able to talk to all the parties in these conflicts, because that's the nature of government policy. You can't. So we do have an added important channel to help reach people through that position. So let me summarise.
If you can wrap up, that would be really helpful.
But literally in one sentence, I'm absolutely clear that we need both local, and we will continue to need the multilateral and the international, because the scale of human suffering and need, humanitarian need, let alone the absence of hope to get to a more development strategic approach, is such a scale, is so huge, that we need to bring all our skills, our experience and the abilities to meet that in order to help people both survive and thrive and be protected in conflict. So when we started the meeting about there is a gap between what we could do compared to what we are doing, I think that is the right question. I think an awful lot of what has become the motive for change, and I do believe this debate today has been important as part of how the stars are beginning to align to help us make the fundamental changes where all of us need to change, and not just some of us, to deliver better and to make sure we root this in a much more context and local specific. But I do think that we've started this about the gap between the resources available compared to the need. And in many ways, whilst that's a truth and a fact, I think that what this report and what today's debate I welcome and I embrace has been, I think, to say, yes, that's obvious, but it's actually the difference between the way we're doing things and what we could do so much better if we changed our way of doing things, yes, which of course includes transparency and accountability, but above all, it's a total set of behaviours and relationships, whether it's us in the multilateral system, whether it's people on the ground, whether it's all the people of great goodwill and skill, and whether it's the donors. We've all got to come together to change our behaviours so we all incentivise better, collaborative, joined up behaviour rather than what has over time grown to be an incentive to be fragmented. And I think that is why the World Humanitarian Summit really does present an opportunity, and I hope I'm right in saying the stars are aligning. I have great hopes for what we can propel forward from the World Humanitarian Summit, and I know I can do that particularly with the sort of support and the comments that we've had today.
Thank you very much, Stephen O'Brien. So I'm just going to wrap up. For me, the most critical thing in this report is it talks about ceding power, letting go of power. In the history of humankind, this really happens. Men don't give up power, women seize it. White people don't give up power, black people seize it. That's how it happens. That is what is happening. Anyway, the world is changing. Whatever people in the humanitarian system or sector want or think, it is already happening. So it is about adapting. I think for me that's the most important fundamental idea in this report, and that is what's most interesting. And what people in this room can do is work out how to take advantage of that and do things better and help people more. Because I'm just a journalist, and all I do is go around the world seeing people suffering and wanting to cry and feeling that what I do is useless because I do nothing to change anything. I just see it and report it. And yet you guys are the ones who are supposed to be working out how to make the world better. And in all the agony of how one does that, we shouldn't lose sight of that basic thing. So thank the panel. So Stephen for joining us from New York, the panel who've taken time to come here. You in the audience, Kevin, ODI. Videos of the event are going to go online in the next few days. You'll be able to get copies of the report. And anybody who wants to stay on and have some coffee, but no cake, I'm seeing, but just coffee, to discuss these issues a little more, please feel free to do so. Thank you all very much. Thank you.